Morning people, welcome back to F Politics. I am disgusted with Laura Kuenssberg's Brexit anniversary interview today, but I'm going to be fair to her, and BBC, Laura Kuenssberg, if you're watching, this is how you do balance as a journalist. Because while she was interviewing Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, about Brexit, she kept making arguments against undoing Brexit that she knew were bad faith arguments. Do you know how I know that she knew they were bad faith arguments? Because while she was interviewing a Tory MP, she literally said this.
The majority of economists, by a long chalk, have suggested that Brexit has had a negative impact on the economy.
So she knows that Brexit is making the people of the UK poorer during a cost of living crisis where poverty is only going up. And yet she opened her interview with Ed Davey by saying this.
Everybody remembers that getting out of the EU, whatever you thought of it, was very long, very complicated, very bitter politically. Who really has the appetite for a long and complicated negotiation to go back into the customs union?
But it won't be the entire population of the UK that is at the table negotiating with the EU. It'll be the politicians. So what she just said essentially boils down to, can politicians really be arsed to address child poverty? Because during the years where Brexit could have been stopped, I spoke to many people in that Westminster political bubble, especially journalists, and a lot of them were simply bored of Brexit. And what Laura Kuenssberg said just there really echoes that she simply can't be arsed to deal with Brexit again, even if it's making millions of people poorer. But fortunately, Ed Davey does quite well in this interview.
When I talk to people out there, families and businesses, they're worried about the cost of living, and they're worried about, can we get the economic growth to pay for our health services, our NHS, education, crime, and all those issues that people care most about. And the question for politicians is, how's the best way to get that growth for our public services and to get prices down? What I'm arguing is if we can have a UK-EU customs union, we can tear down those trade barriers that the Conservatives put up to our exporters and get that growth far more quickly than anything Rachel Reeves and Labour are saying at the moment.
And that's why I'm constantly banging on about Brexit, because I simply can't think of another policy in the UK that is costing us £100 billion a year. Can you? So for anybody who is serious about addressing the cost of living crisis, undoing Brexit has to be at least one of their top priorities. And yet Laura Kuenssberg still replied with this.
But who do you think's got the appetite for a long and complicated negotiation?
I know who has the appetite for negotiating the undoing of Brexit trade barriers. The EU, because they literally said so this morning.
Well, we're still waiting for concrete proposals coming from the British side. Labour did make quite a number of promising announcements for the elections. Since then, we haven't heard too much from them, have we?
Now listen to how she frames the idea of the UK following the rules of the EU in order to protect trade, whether it's the regulations of the single market or the trade policy of the customs union. She frames it as a sellout.
Right, some people would say that you proposing us going back into a customs union would also sell us out, because to be part of a customs union, there might be some benefits, but the UK would have to follow the rules of other countries. And as the saying goes, we would have to be a rule taker and we wouldn't be a rule maker. And we'd be left, having to follow the rules of a club that we're not a full member of.
So, now that the reality of Brexit has become clear that in order to protect our trade, and therefore protect our economy, our rules need to be aligned to the rules of the rest of our continent, making it clear to anybody paying attention that all Brexit did was remove our ability to influence those rules. Laura Kuenssberg is implying that it's the people who are trying to protect our economy by realigning us with EU rules that are selling us out, not the people who drove us down this path in the first place. But again, Ed Davey gives quite a good answer to this.
But Laura, we're a rule taker at the moment, even though we have no influence. I'll give you one example. People will see it in their breakfast tables and at lunches all the time. These bottles now, they have the tops which have to be attached to them to the recyclable. That was an EU regulation. We had no voice on it whatsoever. But UK-based manufacturing companies are applying that regulation to their bottles now.
But the point is they're choosing to in order that they can sell into the Eurozone, and it's their choice.
But Laura, you make my point for me. They're taking those rules so they can market and grow and export. And presumably we want to do that, don't we? We want to grow our economy so we can afford our public services, so we can get inflation down. And if that means doing what we're already having to do with things like bottles, then let's just do it.
But copying the rules of your main market is an unavoidable reality of doing business. So all Brexit did was remove our ability to influence those rules. But because we're no longer in the same rules system, even if we follow those rules independently, our products aren't automatically deemed to be legal in the EU. Checking those products to make sure they're legal costs time, money, and paperwork, so we may as well be back in that system to protect our economy. Now, if that means that for a few years we're going to be following rules over which we no longer have a say until we eventually rejoin the EU properly, then blame Brexiteers for that, not Remainers. But here's the argument from Laura that really pissed me off.
You say it would be helpful to grow our economy. Let's just take a look, though, what's been going on with European growth, those people who are in the EU and therefore are trading like that. Here is the last quarter. Now, the UK grew at a measly 0.1%, but the EU average was 0.1%. Actually, when you look at France, it shrank. Germany shrank. Italy was at 0%. So you're suggesting that if only we went in and were working more closely with those countries, we'd grow more. That doesn't stack up, does it?
No, I think what that shows is that Europe would be keen for a EU-UK trade agreement.
But it doesn't show our viewers that your idea would give us better growth, because in some cases their growth is worse than ours. Well, and in some cases it's the same.
With respect, you've shown a few countries. There are other countries that are growing more strongly than that.
Yes, because if the average growth of EU countries is the same as our growth, then that means that on balance, half the countries of the EU are going to be growing faster than us, and half of them are going to be growing slower than us. And yet the BBC is giving us 3 examples of specific EU countries, none of which are growing faster than us. Do you see how that's obvious propaganda? But that's not even what pisses me off. This entire argument is flawed. Even if every single EU country had a catastrophic economic recession, that wouldn't suddenly mean that Brexit trade barriers were a good thing. Brexit has objectively created trade barriers between the UK and its 30 closest neighbours. That's the 27 countries of the EU plus the 3 single market countries. So for the argument that Laura is making to make any sense at all, she would have to maintain that if the countries of the EU lost trade with their 30 closest neighbours as well, it wouldn't affect those numbers. So the average EU economy might be doing the same as ours right now, but all that proves is that if we rejoined the EU and restored our trade supply routes, we would be doing above average within the EU. And Laura Kuenssberg knows this because, as I said, she said this to a Tory MP.
The majority of economists, by a long chalk, have suggested that Brexit has had a negative impact on the economy.
And when Ed Davey makes the economic points that I just made, she still insists on it.
But your argument when you sat down was that if we join, we will grow more quickly than we are. And the evidence from what's happening in the EU at the moment is they're not growing more quickly than we are. Spain, as you say, some countries are doing better, but the average is 0.1%.
Now, Laura Kuenssberg studied history at university, so when she says that most economists say that Brexit is damaging our economy, what she's saying is people who I know more than me say Brexit is damaging the economy. And yet she's still saying confidently that the evidence from what's happening in the EU proves that Brexit isn't damaging our economy. So she knows that what she's saying isn't true. So why is she doing this? And again, I'm going to be fair to her. So BBC, again, take note, this is how you do balance. Now, you could argue that as a journalist, she's putting different arguments to different politicians to hold them to account for their policy positions, like be more pro-Brexit with the anti-Brexit politicians and be more anti-Brexit with the pro-Brexit politicians. But then that means that the overall output of your TV show is neutral when it comes to the truth. You haven't actually informed people. You've just given both sides of an argument and treated the facts, the reality, as a secondary issue. Because that both sides thing is only really excusable if you come down hard on the side of reality as soon as the politicians have finished speaking. But she doesn't do that. When Ed Davey wasn't there, she was still doing the both sides thing.
Plenty of Brexiteers would say we haven't made the most of the freedoms it offered. Plenty on the other side that their warnings that it would be damaging to the country have come true.
And when Ed Davey was there, during a conversation that was largely around Brexit, she said this about the Reform Party.
It's Reform UK, Nigel Farage's party, who've been the ones who've been the real challengers, and you're still bumping along the bottom. So what's Reform getting right that you're getting wrong?
But Laura Kuenssberg has already acknowledged that most economists say Brexit is damaging our economy, and that's Brexit with a trade deal. The Reform Party wants to do Brexit without a trade deal. Like, in a normal world, no news channel would ever allow anybody from the Reform Party to ever give economic advice on TV again. And yet Laura Kuenssberg is pointing to the Reform Party as an example of getting it right during a conversation about Brexit. So that conversation wasn't even 50-50, it was skewed in favour of Brexit. And the defence of being 50-50 doesn't even hold its own weight in an era of social media propaganda, because not everybody is going to watch your entire interview. If I was the Reform Party, I'd just take the bit where Laura Kuenssberg points to other EU countries as proof that Brexit isn't hurting us, cut that up with the bit where she says that Reform Party is getting it right, and then I'd put that out to all my millions of followers. So when you do this 50-50 bullshit in 2025, you're not just propaganda yourself, you're also fueling and giving ammunition to more propagandists. The BBC are knowingly fueling lies that are keeping millions of people trapped in poverty, and that is why I'm disgusted. I'm Femi. Make sure you follow F Politics so politics doesn't F you. Have a great week.